and welcome back to Bites of History with Irene Walton. I'm your host, Irene Walton, and today we're talking Disney, baby.
Have you ever wondered how it made it to your table? Have you ever wondered how it made it to your shelf? If you love food, then this is the show for you. Bites of History with Irene.
You guys, I cannot tell you how excited I am to be doing this episode. It has been on my list of topics for like 10 months. Like since I started the podcast, I've wanted to do this, but I've been a little intimidated because I'm like, oh my gosh, what if I don't get everything? And what if it's not in depth enough? And what if it's too in depth? You know, whatever. Insecurity. But then I remembered, hold on, Rini, this is your podcast. You can do what you want. So then it got me thinking, maybe this will just be a multi-part episode. I've never been mad at a multi-part episode. The only thing I want is for them to keep putting the episodes out. So that's what we're going to do today. This is the History of Disney Foods Part 1. Now, y'all know I do not like to start my podcast without a little bit of gratitude right up top. So I want to say a big, gigantic, huge end of Thanksgiving week thank you to all of my patrons. I have seen a lot of new people popping in, and it means a lot to me. I can't even get into it without getting like too misty, but it's just really, really special to see longtime followers, high school friends, like all of these people coming to support. It means the absolute world. If you guys want to become a patron, you can check that out at patreon.com/Irene Walton. The tiers start at only $2. You can become a little producer for just $2 to help support the podcast, help support me, and it means a lot. So thank you to everybody who has joined, and thank you to everyone who's even just checked it out. Just watching means so much, and just listening to the episodes means a lot. So thank you for that as well. And we have two sponsors of today's episode. We have Olivia Motez, or Motes, or Mote. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce it, but thank you, Olivia. And we have Allison McDaniel sponsoring an episode. Thank you so very much, Allison. It was so, so sweet of you guys to sponsor. So let's say thank you to some of our sources. This is a long one. Big old breath. DisneyParks.disney.go.com, History.com, DisneyFoodBlog.com, SFGate.com, Forbes.com, the Food History of Disneyland podcast, the His podcast, DisneyClassics.com, MentalFloss.com, and Wikipedia.com. Thank you guys very much. Couldn't do the research without ya. Today on the podcast, we're going to be talking a little bit about the history of Disneyland. We're going to be talking about how food got integrated into Disneyland at all, and an incredibly famous product that we all know and love today that came out of one of the first ever restaurants at Disneyland. I think you guys are going to be so surprised. Let's get started. It's July 17th, 1955, and it was supposed to be a friends and family type of opening of Disneyland for people that Walt knew. However, those tickets that got sent out to like the smaller group of people that were supposed to come and try Disneyland out, unfortunately got counterfeited, and a lot more people than expected went to the opening day. Now, so many more people than expected that the food and drink ran out. Mark Twain's steamboat almost capsized because there were way too many people on it. A woman's high-heeled shoe got stuck in the asphalt because it was still wet. It was just a situation that wasn't ready for that many people. So needless to say, it was a pretty kooky day for Mr. Disney. This was a process that was 366 days in the making. So from the day it began to the day it opened was a year and a day. I don't know if you guys know this about Disney. He was one of the people that I did every single biography project on in school. It was him and Milton Hershey. I think I mentioned that in the Hershey episode. For some reason, I was just very drawn to those two men in business, and I always wanted to write about them. So if you guys didn't know this about Mr. Disney, he was quite the perfectionist. He had a lot of hang-ups about Disneyland. He wanted things to be perfect. He started this budget. I think it was supposed to be like $6 million. It ended up being something like the total was like $17 million that it took to open Disneyland, because he wanted to change things like on King Arthur's carousel. He wanted the horses to look like they were leaping instead of just galloping. So it was all of these crazy like intricacies and changes that he made, which, you know, make Disney as magical as it is, but it was definitely not an easy road to open it. So he was already in a little bit of a lurch money-wise opening Disneyland. now that's where our first restaurants come in. The first restaurants at Disneyland were heavily branded because they were sponsored restaurants. So there are these branded restaurants. And by branded, I mean there was a Chicken of the Sea pirate ship. There was Casa de Fritos. There was Carnation Cafe, like the ice cream. And he had all of these branded restaurants because he really needed some help getting out of this $17 million debt. So this was a perfect way to start that. And not only did these branded restaurants help Disney sort of come out of the lurch of that debt, but it also established credibility for Disney as well as these brands. I think obviously Disneyland was a new, surprising, risky venture. But I think with the credibility that Disney had already grown, the brands were much more likely to associate with Disney himself and the park and the whole brand together. You know what I mean? With that, Disney also got the credibility of being like, hey, look, Fritos is hopping on. Chicken of the Sea is hopping on. Coca-Cola is hopping on. These are all brands that my customers, my patrons are going to know and love. So they'll think that Disneyland is also a little more credible just by having these names around. Now, there were 47 total branded entities within Disneyland. A lot of them were food, but there were other ones as well. But obviously, it's bites of history. We're going to focus on the food ones. And we cannot even begin to talk about Disney and branding and sponsorships and collaborations without mentioning Coca-Cola, which you guys, I'm going to do an episode on Coke. It's just another one. Here's the thing. And I'm going to take a second. Everybody's like, oh, it's your podcast. I have no other choice. I am still just a little tiny baby podcaster. And I'm excited for when I'm on a big, beautiful network and they pay for, all of this stuff and I get help with research and all this stuff. But for right now, some of these topics that I'm so excited to do sort of just seem like a little bit too big and scary. Sort of make me a little nervous. And I want to do them. Like I want to do McDonald's. I want to do Coca-Cola. I want to do all of these big, cool brands, but they're just a little intimidating. It feels sort of like when a true crime podcast is like, okay, we're going to do Ted Bundy. And it's like, there's just so much stuff to cover and I don't want to miss it. So I am getting to a bunch of different cool brands, but I just wanted to let you guys know if you were like, Irene, why have you talked about the World's Fair 200 years ago and not Coca-Cola? That's why. But anyway, back to the ep. Now, Disney and Coca-Cola had been working together collaboratively since way before Disneyland opened. Disneyland opened in 1955. The first connection we see between Disney and Coca-Cola was when Walt Disney appeared in the 1942 radio segment called The Pause That Refreshes on the Air. And it's called that because one of Coca-Cola's slogans in the beginning of its life was the pause that refreshes. So this was the pause that refreshes on the air, a little radio show that Walt Disney was a part of. Then a couple years later in 1950, Coca-Cola in turn sponsored Walt Disney's An Hour in Wonderland, his TV special. And then 5 years later, when Disneyland opens, Coca-Cola is right alongside Disney, as always, and is sponsoring the refreshment corner, which is still found on Main Street. You can see the big old Coke sign. It's very cool. We can really see the credibility aspect of Walt Disney's first sponsorships when it comes to food and restaurants really come through with this Coke sponsorship. That's what they both care about. They both are like, oh, everybody loves Disney because they're fun and cute and kid-friendly and family-friendly. And Disney's like, everybody loves Coke because it's fucking Coke and it's fun and positive and delicious and refreshing. So this was working really well for them on both sides of the spectrum. But if you guys remember, I told you that Disney had 47 sponsors on that list when they first opened, and Pepsi was also right alongside it. So there is this like big soda war going on between Coke and Pepsi when it comes to Disneyland. I know a lot of us associate Coke with Disneyland. They've had a lot of like fun collaborations over the years. They do a lot of cool stuff together. So when you do see like Pepsi stuff associated with Disney, it's kind of weird. But for a long time, it sort of separated the park. Like in Fantasyland, you would get Pepsi products in most of the restaurants. And in Frontierland, you would get Coke products in most of the restaurants. The only place that you could get Coke as well as Pepsi products was in Fantasyland at the restaurant called Space Place. Now, we see a huge Pepsi moment at the 1981 World's Fair. The World's Fairs are so crazy. Everybody's doing everything there. So we first see It's a Small World sponsored by Pepsi through Disney at the World's Fair in 1981. However, in 1990, we finally see an end to this cola war, and Coca-Cola wins pure exclusivity with all Disney parks and all Disney-related items. So now that we know how Coca-Cola got exclusivity throughout all of the Disney parks, we're going to talk about an incredibly famous chip that was born out of a trash can at Casa de Frito. And no, it's not Fritos. Fritos were already established and invented. But I do want you to leave in the comments what chip you think it is, unless I already put it in the thumbnail. In which case, just leave a nice comment telling me that I'm doing well. So as mentioned before, one of our sponsored restaurants at Disneyland, when it first opens, this is a month after it opens in August of 1955, we see Casa de Fritos open. Now, Fritos have already been an established thing. We can do a whole episode on that if you want. But Fritos have been around since like the 30s or 40s. Casa de Fritos is this it's a Mexican themed restaurant. So it's 1950s Anaheim Mexican restaurant. They're doing tamales and tacos, and they have Frito pie, which, oh my God, if you guys have not had Frito pie, you've got to try it. It's so delicious. I know about it because my mom's from Texas, but Frito pie is amazing. It's like a bag of Fritos and you put chili and cheese and onions. Oh, incredible. Anyway, Casa de Fritos is this established restaurant, but it's also kind of an attraction in and of itself because they have this, what we would probably now think is like a little creepy, but I think is so kitschy and perfect and incredible. They had this animatronic statue / vending machine, and his name was the Frito Kid. And he was this large mechanical thing. His mouth moved. People could go, and while they were waiting in line, or if they just wanted a little snack, they could go pay the Frito Kid a nickel. And he would then say something to his buddy Klondike, who is in the, he's the miner who is in the mine that the Frito Kid is in front of. In Casa de Frito, there is this big mine. The Frito Kid's in front of it, and his, pretend buddy Klondike, who we cannot see, is in the mine. So Frito would then call to his friend, and he would say, once he gets the nickel, he would say, "Someone else knows what's good. Another bag of Fritos, Klondike." And then Klondike, with a very echoey voice, would be like, "Okay, coming right up. One bag of crisp salted Fritos." And so that would happen. And then the Fritos would dispense in this little wax paper bag, and you would have your little thing of Fritos. So it was a cute, silly little thing. Very Disney, very precious, very, very loved. Popping back to our famous trip. I just wanted to give you some background on Casa de Fritos because I think it's cute and interesting. Popping back to our famous chip that gets invented. Let's rewind. Casa de Fritos is a Mexican restaurant. Now, they did not have the time or the ability to make everything in-house, like a lot of restaurants don't. And so they had a wholesale supplier who was called Alex Foods. Alex Foods provided them the tortillas that they used for tamales, for tacos, for things like that. And one day when an Alex Food rep was coming in to check things out, deliver something, whatever it was, he saw that the cooks had thrown away a lot of the tortillas. He said, "Hey, what's wrong? What happened?" And the cook said, "Oh, they were kind of stale, or they broke, or whatever." And the food rep was like, "Oh, you could just fry them up and sell them as tortilla chips." And the cooks were like, "Oh, okay." So they're putting these tortilla chips on the menu in the early 1960s, and they're doing very, very well. If you're wondering what these chips were called, they were called Doraditos, which stood for Little Fried and Golden Thing. And that eventually got turned into Doritos. So it's been just about a year, and the Doritos have been crushing it on the Casa de Frito menu. So Casa de Frito, which is owned by Frito-Lay, who was sponsoring the restaurant through Disney, one of the marketing executives came in to check things out. This guy, Archibald West, who's the marketing executive, he's like, "Oh my God, what's going on? Why does everybody love these chips so much?" So he got a bag of the chips. He loved them. He was totally fatal for them. And he was like, "Okay, these are obviously doing really well. I'm glad that they, came from our little sponsored restaurant in Disneyland. We're going to reach out to Alex Foods and see what's up." So Arch West was like, "Okay, hey, Alex Foods. Oh my God, love the idea. Thank you so much for that, by the way. We want to start producing these Doritos through you guys regionally." And then they start getting really popular in like the public sphere. So not just in Disneyland. So Archibald West is like, okay, like let's move these to our plant in Tulsa and distribute them nationally. And so we have Doritos all over the nation by 1966. The first flavor that we have is just our original like toasted corn tortilla. And then in 1968, we get our first flavored Dorito, which is actually the taco Dorito. In 1974, we see the nacho cheese Dorito come out. And then in 1986, Cool Ranch, which I know is so many people's favorite, enters the market and does very well as well. My favorite, if you were wondering, is Salsa Verde. Now it is one of America's most popular chips. And I just think it's so cool that it was born out of like a trash can in Casa de Fritos in Disneyland. Well, you guys, that was part 1 of the food history of Disneyland. I'm so excited to get to part 2, where we're going to talk about Dole Whips and turkey legs and a bunch of other fun facts and fun little bits about the history of Disney food. Thank you so much for listening today. If you guys want to like, comment, and subscribe down below, that would be just amazing. And I'll see you next week. Goodbye.